Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Face to Face, 10 Very Close Encounters with Extraterrestrials. I'm not going to do a long introduction this time. You know what my episodes are about. I love talking about the closest of all encounters, and I think we have a lot to learn from the humanoid cases. And I've picked 10 which I think you probably haven't heard before, coming from all over the world, including France, Italy, Norway, Spain, Sweden, Canada, of course the United States, Peru, and even Russia. And I've got about 100-year spread here because the earliest case is 1915 and the last case is 2012. So I'm hoping these cases you find interesting and they help provide some insights into what ET contact is like, why they're here, and what is going on with this whole situation. So let's just get started because this is going to be a pretty long episode. And the first case I like to talk about I call the Smiling Aliens. I like this case because it's a very early case. It occurred in summer of 1915, long before UFOs were really a thing, or even the idea of extraterrestrials visiting our planet was in the popular culture. This took place in Norway, specifically in a rural area known as Jakobsbakken. And it's a really interesting case that illustrates the type of encounter that happens over and over again, where a UFO lands, humanoids come out, and provide a very short meeting with a witness. This very early case comes from researcher Ole Johnny Brain, and it is among the first documented UFO landing and humanoid reports in the country of Norway. It was published in the 1981 Volume 4 issue of the Norwegian magazine Rapport Nytt. The main witness is Bjarne Westvand, and it took place in a very rural area of Norway known as Jakobsbakken. This is located in Sulitjelma, not far from a large and active mining facility. This may be significant here. Bjarne was 6 years old and had been playing with the other children in the area. He was walking home when a bell-shaped object appeared in the western sky and began to land behind a small hill near the town's mining site. When this happened, Bjarne was rooted to the spot, he said, unable to move, and this is when he noticed two human-like figures coming from down the hill towards the road in front of him. They suddenly turned around and began to walk directly towards him. These two beings spoke briefly to each other in a loud, booming voice, though Bjarne was unable to understand what they were saying. Then one of them stopped while the other continued to approach him. Now, according to Bjarne, this humanoid had a smile on his face. He was very short, about 3 feet tall, very close to Bjarne's own height. This figure had an abnormally large head, long, wavy hair, and grayish skin. He was dressed in a brown jumpsuit. The one that had remained behind was dressed in a similar jumpsuit, although of a darker color. And this was it, basically. Then the two humanoids returned down the road, climbed back up this small hill, and disappeared behind it. And moments later, this bell-like object that he had seen land reappeared, rising from behind the hill, and it quickly darted off into the sky. Now at this time, Bjarne had no idea about flying saucers or extraterrestrials. He was unable to understand who these people were or where they might have come from, and he wasn't really able to process or interpret this experience. But later as an adult, he heard about UFOs, heard about cases like his, and it was about 65 years later after his encounter that he finally reported it to UFO researchers. What an interesting case that is. Admittedly, it is a single witness account, purely anecdotal, but I find it fascinating that even the witness himself didn't jump to the extraterrestrial explanation until many years later when he started hearing reports that were very similar to his. It's certainly a fascinating case because it occurred so early. I've heard many people say there aren't any humanoid reports before the 1940s, and that's simply not true, as this case illustrates so plainly. And now let's move to the next one, which is also a really fascinating case. I call this one the quarry alien. This ET was seen in a quarry. This is a pattern we see in a number of cases where ETs seem to show interest in mining areas. So perhaps that's what was going on here. It took place on May 30th, 1971 in an area known as Dennett, France. And I like this case because this witness got a very good look at this UFO and this very interestingly described humanoid. The main witness in this case is Madame Pierrette de Beauflet. She's a housewife in her 40s. She had no interest in UFOs when, at 2:05 p.m. on May 30th, 1971, she stepped out of her home in Dennett, France, to pick some grass to feed her rabbits. At the time of her encounter, her home was located about 1,000 feet away from this chalk quarry and cement factory, which you can see here. She then noticed something else odd, because looking up towards the quarry, she saw a dark gray metallic looking object shaped kind of like an upside down bowl with a dome on top, and it was hovering just a few feet above the ground, about 2,500 feet away. She said it was motionless, fairly large, about the size of a nearby bulldozer, and she estimates maybe about 10 feet wide, 4 to 5 feet high, so not terribly large. And examining the area around the strange object, she immediately noticed this dark silhouette of a strange figure stepping out from a field of clover and walking directly into this quarry. She said it was easily visible against the white background of the chalk, and she was puzzled because this figure was quite short. Her husband actually worked at the quarry, and she had seen him there on numerous occasions, so she could easily see that this figure was much shorter than her husband. It was also odd because this was a Sunday, and she knew good and well that nobody worked in the quarry on a Sunday. In fact, she first thought that this might be a child who had wandered in there. But there were some other strange details. This figure had a very bulky torso, an abnormally large round head, and the head had a sort of shiny halo around it. Now this figure also walked with a strange oscillating gait, kind of waddling like a duck at times, but at other times seemed to glide above the ground, and it was moving up and down along with the terrain. So at this point she realized that this was probably not a child, but something quite strange. It was definitely taking up more and more of her attention, and she watched it bend down and pick up something, which she presumed had to be a piece of chalk, as there was really nothing else out there. But the longer she watched it, which was almost 10 minutes, the more intrigued she became, and she began to slowly back up towards her home in order to let her husband know about this strange figure. Now she saw again that this being was walking at times, but at other times gliding, and started moving towards this object that she had seen. And when it reached the object, she says it stooped down slightly and went below it, and then seemed to be immediately sucked up inside it. The craft then promptly rose, moving diagonally, gliding up the slope of the quarry. And seeing this unusual craft rising up off the ground, she knew she was seeing a UFO at this point, and she began to run home to get her husband. But the craft then darted away at lightning speed, making no noise whatsoever that she could detect, and as it did this, it emitted a powerful burst of white light. She said it was, quote, as fast as an arrow and without the least noise. So seeing this, she stood there in total astonishment for a few moments, then broke out of this spell and ran to tell her husband and her daughter. And when they both came out to look, the object was already gone. Now her husband, however, said that his wife was in a state of panic when she ran inside to tell them of this UFO. Later, her husband and neighbor checked the location, but found no evidence in terms of landing traces. But they did report the case to investigators, and they found her very believable and very sincere. And in fact, they reenacted the incident and confirmed that the details Pierrette described were consistent from the location of her observation. So there you go. It's another case of a landed UFO and humanoid seen at pretty close range. It's quite fascinating. It is, again, a single witness case with no real supporting physical evidence, though it was professionally researched. The investigators, again, found her quite credible. And yeah, I think the case has something to offer to our understanding of what's going on here, because we have so many cases like this where UFOs land in geographically or geologically interesting areas. And now we move to another case. This one is super fascinating because it's actually a series of events, multiple witnesses, so there's quite a bit of corroboration here, including landing traces as well. I call this one the Gitchie-Manitou UFO wave. This occurred on July 5, 1976, in the Gitchie-Manitou State Park in Iowa. It's a fascinating case, and one of my favorite in this little collection here. Throughout the spring and summer of 1976, the Gitchie-Manitou State Park, located along the border of Iowa and South Dakota, had been the location of an incredible series of UFO encounters, including a multiple witness UFO landing and humanoid case, complete with strange landing traces. Now, one of the first incidents occurred at 11:30 p.m. one evening in mid-April of 1976, when Linda Sayre, age 20, was heading south on County Road 115, which approaches the park and then veers east. You can see it here. And as she approached this corner, she saw, ahead of her car, a large, oblong, glowing white object with lights flashing, she said, like sparks, around the edges. This object was shaped, she said, kind of like an army helmet, was glowing dim on top, very brightly on the bottom, and had a dark line around the circumference where there was this line of glittering lights. And she said it was so low that it looked like it was actually going to land. So she slowed down to avoid it, at which point it moved very fast with a kind of wobbly motion to the side of the road over a field. As she continued her trip, she said the craft actually followed her, pacing her car. She raced home, ran inside to tell her parents, but by the time they got outside, the craft was gone. Her parents, however, could tell that she was quite frightened, and it wouldn't be long before she had another encounter. Now, meanwhile, it was just over 2 months later, around 9 a.m. on July 5, 1976, that two young boys, Andy Rigg, age 8, and his little brother, Joel, age 6, they had walked a short distance from their home to the Gitchie-Manitou Park and were playing under a picnic shelter when they started to hear these weird, unidentifiable noises. They stopped their play and listened, at which point they heard this grunting sound followed by a high, shrill whistle. And looking towards the source, they saw something they could hardly believe. About 70 feet away, right behind a bush, stood what appeared to be a figure about 7 feet tall. While they couldn't see much detail of his face or body, one of his legs was clearly exposed, and they could see that he was wearing some kind of shiny blue clothing. At this point, the noises started to become louder, so the two boys ran about a quarter of a mile back to where their older brothers, Chris, age 11, and Tom, age 9, were. This happened to be the very corner where just a few months earlier, Linda Sayre had had her encounter. So the younger boys excitedly described what they had seen to their older brothers and pointed to the area, and at that moment, all four boys saw a glowing object emerge from behind a tree about 150 feet south of them, again in the Gitchie-Manitou Park. This object rose just above the trees, paused for about 5 seconds, and it was close enough for all of them to hear a humming noise coming from it. They said it was shaped like a haystack, very similar in size. It was glowing white and pulsating in brightness. And then immediately this object sped rapidly off to the south, disappearing in the distance. Now the encounters weren't over yet, because it was 1 week later that Linda Rosenboom, who lives 3/4 of a mile north of the Riggs, said that she was awakened by her dogs at 1:30 a.m., and looking out the window saw a pulsating object hovering 1 mile to the southeast, very close to where the previous 2 encounters had occurred. And as she says, "I tried to think of what it could be, but it was just too big to be anything I knew of. It wasn't a normal light. It was white or bluish white." So she immediately woke up her husband, but by the time he got up, the object was just beginning to fade, and then it disappeared. As the witness says, "I don't know if it went off or landed or left. After that, I couldn't sleep for 2 weeks. I kept getting up to see what every little noise was." So by this time, news was spreading through this small community that UFOs were being seen. And another resident of the area, Sarah Strike, said that around this time, her dog started barking at the sky and, quote, "carrying on something fierce." Now, she didn't see anything, but fearing a prowler, she called the police. The police came out, they patrolled the area, but said they saw nothing. They left, and her dogs were still barking. So both Sarah and Linda Rosenboom said that they talked to others who had seen the UFOs, but they were too afraid of ridicule to come forward. So apparently a lot of people were seeing this. One witness who did have the courage to come forward was Jack Wright, who said that he and his wife saw a UFO earlier, just north of the park, just south of Highway 38. And he said it was about as long as 4 football fields. It had 2 giant yellow lights, 5 feet in diameter, and was moving very slowly at treetop level right over them and the highway, scaring them quite badly. He first thought these were separate lights, but as the object came closer, he could see no, this was one solid object, and they both watched it move off and could see red lights on the back of it. And it was moving slowly. They said no faster than 10 miles per hour. Now, again, events were still in progress. 9 days after the Rig Boys sighting, this same witness decided he was going to go to the area where this UFO had hovered. And he found that some of the leaves on the oak trees, exactly where the boys had seen the object come up, showed signs of high heat. He said the upper leaves were yellowed and the lower leaves were splotched and curled. So he visited again 5 days later and saw that all the upper leaves on this tree had died and fallen off. As he says, "The boys' story became really believable for me because of those trees. It really spooks me. I wish I hadn't seen them." And sightings continued into August. Linda Sear, the first witness, saw the UFOs a second time. Rick Schultz, who lives in Hartford, South Dakota, which is about 25 miles to the northwest, said that he saw a, quote, "big red ball of fire," which actually came up from the ground and accelerated away, changing directions 3 or 4 times. As Rick says, "It really scared me. I've never seen anything like that." He also called the police and later learned that the police had received multiple reports of strange lights in the area. So even a half a year later, reports were still coming in, because in early March of 1977, Doug Wilkins of Hawarden, about 40 miles from the Gitchie-Manitou Park, also saw an object which he says, quote, "speeded up when I did and slowed down when I did. I began to get scared when it started taking curves with me." So he went home and alerted his family, and they all saw it. And this appeared to be the end of the wave, or at least the witnesses stopped talking. Interestingly, Gitchie-Manitou, this word is a Native American word, and it means the great creator god of the Anishinaabe and many neighboring Algonquin tribes as well. The name literally means great spirit, which is a common phrase used to address God in many Native American languages. UFO activity does sometimes seem to come in little flaps, little waves, clusters of activity, and that's certainly true here. There must have been something going on in this area that was of interest to the ETs, because it did go on for quite some time. And I always love it when there's independent witnesses who aren't aware of each other's accounts and are still seeing really unusual activity. And of course the landing traces in this case are quite compelling. and were verified by multiple witnesses. So it's another fascinating case. And here's one that I find of particular interest because I've done a lot of research into cases of UFO healings. And that's what apparently occurred in this case, which I call cured of arthritis. This occurred on September 6, 1976, in a very rural area of Peru called Carabaya. Now, these witnesses were driving along on a highway, as we'll see, when they had their encounter. But it's such a fascinating case in so many ways. This very interesting case was widely published in local newspapers and involves, again, both an apparent healing and landing traces. The two witnesses include a married couple, Leoncio Jara Torres and his wife Elena. It was around 8 p.m., September 6, 1976, as they drove their truck through the very rural area of Carabaya. This is several hundred miles southwest of Lima, Peru. Without warning, they saw a UFO drop from the sky and land 100 feet ahead of them on the road. This craft was pretty big, about 10 feet high, 65 to 70 feet in diameter. They said it had 2 portholes and was emitting a, quote, powerful light. There were also colored lights on it. And as soon as this craft landed, their truck stalled, and almost immediately 2 glowing figures emerged and immediately approached them in their truck. And as Leoncio says, from the craft descended 2 human-looking figures. They looked human. They carried 2 powerful flashlights that they used to blind us and limit our vision. They shone the 2 flashlights on us, approached the truck, and touched us on the back. My wife fainted. I instead was dumb. I couldn't think of anything. I was scared stiff. Now, Leoncio reports that these ETs were both male, about 5 feet 8 inches in height, and wore, quote, shining clothing. They approached the truck with very short steps. He said that the touch of the ET was very hot, and that he had the feeling of, quote, as if something burned me, an intense heat that went to my bones. The heat went to our very bones. We felt a terrible heat. Their hands practically burned our bodies. We remained as if hypnotized. Now, all in all, the encounter was very brief, about 1 minute. After these apparent ETs placed their hands on both Leoncio's and Elena's backs, they left the couple alone. And as Leoncio says, the luminous beings then went back towards the craft, and after entering it, took off vertically at terrific speed. It took the couple a few hours to recover from this encounter. Afterwards, they went directly to the police, who began an investigation. The story quickly leaked out to reporters, who also went to the site and found, quote, strange traces on the ground. Now, the witnesses did go to a doctor where they were found to be perfectly healthy and were treated only for, quote, intense nervousness. Important here is prior to the encounter, both Leoncio and Elena suffered from arthritis, but following the encounter, they found that their arthritis symptoms had been alleviated. I think that case is quite important. I wrote a book about UFO healing cases outlining some 300 plus cases. This case isn't in it. I wish I had known about it because I would have included it because I have a number of cases of people cured of arthritis. And just judging from the series of events that took place in this case, I honestly think, and I am speculating here, but I honestly think that that was the purpose of the encounter, given that it was quite brief. The ETs came out, walked up to the car, placed their hands physically on both witnesses, and essentially cured them. It's a really fascinating case, and I also like it because it has electromagnetic effects with their car stopping and landing trace evidence as well. So it's a pretty well confirmed case that certainly got a lot of attention at that time. Now, moving along. I love this next case because it provides an important insight into what's going on here. There are all kinds of humanoids on our planet, and some of them perhaps are not extraterrestrials as we would think of them, but perhaps more correctly defined as cryptoterrestrials, humanoids who exist on our planet but have yet to be accepted or identified by mainstream science. And I'm speculating that that's what's going on in this case, which I call the Little Man of Dunn, North Carolina. It's a fascinating case with multiple witnesses and some what we would call landing trace evidence, footprints actually. But it occurred on October 12th and October 25th, both in 1976, in this little town of Dunn, North Carolina. And it's such a fascinating case of a very unusual humanoid. This, I think, is an important case because it allows for a different interpretation of some of these humanoids. Not all strange humanoids are necessarily ETs, and might be something more akin to leprechauns, gnomes, elves, fairy, or little people that are reported in many countries all over the world and have been reported for centuries. Consider what happened here. This case involves multiple witnesses and footprint evidence. It comes from researchers Janet and Colin Board, and the incident took place in Dunn, North Carolina. This city was actually formerly known as Lucknow. Now, the first witness was 8-year-old Tonley Barefoot, who, around 5 p.m. on October 12, 1976, was out playing in the field of dried cornstalks near his home, located at the intersections of Jonesboro Road and Hodges Chapel Road, again in Dunn, North Carolina. His mom was nearby picking peas from the garden, and looking a short distance away, Tonley was surprised to see a little man who he said was, quote, not much bigger than a Coke bottle. This little man was watching him with an open mouth. He said this figure had a mustache, wore a blue shirt with a pretty white tie, and trousers made of, quote, shiny stuff. He also had a black German-type hat with a weird emblem on it that looked to Tonley like crossed rifles. On his feet, he wore black boots. And when this little man saw that Tonley had noticed him, he, per Tonley, quote, let out a little squeal like a mouse, and then ran off among the cornstalks. So needless to say, this quite impressed Tonley, and he immediately ran off and told his mother, who unfortunately did not believe him. And in fact, nobody did, which really upset him. In fact, he cried all that night. The next day, however, he was vindicated when numerous little footprints were found, exactly where Tonley said he saw this man. And 2 days later, a second set of tiny footprints were found about 450 feet away and were allegedly photographed. These footprints measured at 2 1/4 inches long, 1 inch wide at the heel, and had boot marks in them. So what's interesting is Tonley always stuck to his story for years. In fact, years later, Tonley's niece heard the story from her uncle, and she says that, quote, it is a true story and very real. When my uncle Tonley first told me the story, I didn't believe him. I thought he was losing his mind, but I was wrong. He showed me pictures and took me to the exact place he had seen his little leprechaun, he called it. It's incredible. And in further confirmation of what Tonley saw, thankfully for him, about 2 weeks later and only a few miles away, there was another sighting of apparently this same strange little man. It was 6:20 in the morning of October 25, 1976, as 20-year-old Shirley Ann McCrimmon, who lived at the 800 block of East Hartnett Street, she was returning home from a party. She unlocked her door, went inside, and left it ajar so she could find the light switch. So she turns on the lights and goes to close the door, and this is when she hears a strange noise coming from outside, like someone moving around in the bushes. So she looked out, and she was shocked to see a little man about 1 foot tall. She said he had light brown skin and appeared to be wearing a thin garment, though she can't be sure about that, but she did see he was wearing boots. And no sooner did she see him than this little man shone a tiny yellow light across her eyes. She let out a loud scream, and this little man ran away, scampering around the side of her house, at which point her dogs began barking. Now she later went outside to investigate and did find a little footprint, and wisely she tried to preserve it by covering it with a plastic container. She told her neighbors about the sighting, showed them the footprint. They hadn't seen anything and they were kind of disbelieving, but she was serious about this, serious enough to call the police, who came to investigate. A reporter actually heard about the sighting and was interviewing her and was about to look at the footprint when a child accidentally destroyed it when he tried to lift the container that was preserving the footprint and accidentally erased it. But looking around, they did find a second, but fainter footprint. It was still legible, and when measured, it turned out to be the exact same size as those reported earlier by Tonley. Now, I suppose it's possible that that 1-foot little man was an ET, but there was no UFO seen. The way it was dressed, the way it was described, sounds a lot more like a little elf or a gnome or a fairy, or, as the main witness said, a leprechaun. I think we struggle to categorize and define these little people, but they are seen in cultures all over the world. And as you can see, still being seen. So it's an important case because people, I think, are trying to conflate perhaps fairy folk and little people with ETs. And I'm wondering if they're completely separate phenomena. This is very hard to prove, but that's what it looks like to me, just my 2 cents. And for that reason, I wanted to include this case because I think it speaks to all the different things that are going on here on our planet. All right, moving along. Here's another really interesting case involving a face-to-face encounter with apparent extraterrestrials. This I call the alien couple. It occurred on August 3rd, 1977, again in a very rural area of Escalada, Spain. And while this is a single witness case, there are some really profound, apparent physiological or perhaps emotional effects, and also some other really strange things that happened during this encounter, which make it unique and certainly of interest. The only witness in this case is 20-year-old Seferina Vargas Martin, and she is described by the researchers of her case as a, quote, balanced, quiet person. They said she's well respected by her family and neighbors in this very small town of Escalada, located in the middle of the Sierra Morena Mountains in Spain. It was around 7:30 p.m. on August 3rd, 1977, as the witness, Seferina, was listening to a soap opera on the radio and then left her home to visit her grandmother's in order to help with household chores. Her grandmother lived about 1.5 miles away in the village of La Corte. So along with her, she carried a purse with her identity card, some bus tickets, and other items, and off she set to her grandmother's house. She had walked for a few minutes along this isolated and rural dirt path in a gorge bordering a stream. There were high mountains surrounding her, and it was now near dusk when strange things began to occur. The first was this dazzling flash of light which hit her face, and it seemed to come, she thought, from the stream next to her. She thought it might be a piece of broken mirror or glass in the stream, but for some reason it made her nervous, and she began to walk faster along the narrow path. Or at least she tried to, because weirdly, she felt as if some strange force was slowing her pace. So she's moving along about 50 feet further along the path, and she was momentarily blinded by another flash of light in her face, which she likened to a, quote, lightning bolt. She said this was more like a beam of light coming from a bicycle headlight and was very painful to the eyes. And at the same time that this light hit her, she felt a strange weakness coming over her body. So now she's quite nervous and scared and wanting to hurry along, but directly in front of her she saw that there were 2 strange figures, a woman and a man, standing on the path less than 15 feet in front of her, precisely from where this dazzling light had come. The woman, she said, was taller than the man, about 6 feet tall, she estimates. The man, again, was slightly shorter, maybe 5.5 feet. but Seferina was mostly shocked by their very unusual appearance and attire. The woman had flat blonde hair, very long, reaching down to the center of her back. She had very large eyes with high eyebrows. Her nose was quite unusual, consisting only of two small openings, vertical slits, and her mouth was just a thin line. This woman was dressed in a dark green robe which seemed to sparkle brightly with tiny lights, and although female, appeared to be flat-chested. This tunic had wide sleeves and reached all the way to the ground, and this woman was gesturing with her arms and seemed to be speaking, though she didn't hear anything. Now the man had very similar facial features, but his hair was quite disheveled, and he wore a light brown robe that also seemed to sparkle with light. It didn't reach the ground, but just down to his knees, and from the knees down he wore a darker tunic, which also flashed with light, and had this strange design of wavy vertical lines on it. Now even weirder, both these figures had unusual yellowish skin, and there was something about their faces that Seferina found, quote, repulsive, though she couldn't say exactly what it was. And their behavior was unusual. They just kind of stood there looking at her with indifference. And as they stood there, Seferina felt herself becoming overcome with weakness, and very quickly she began to pass out. She just had time to sit down on a stone next to her when she lost consciousness. Now when she woke up, it was now dark. She quickly ran back to her home, arriving at about 8:50. This walk, which would normally take about 20 minutes, had lasted almost an hour. So at some point, Seferina opened her purse and found something very unusual. Her identity card was missing. Also missing was the crown of her watch and some of her used bus tickets. So word spread quickly, and some men of the village went to search the area, and they were joined the next day by the civil guard. They did find a few of her bus tickets, but there was still no sign of her watch or ID card. There was no other sign of anything else strange that was found. But that night she suffered from nightmares, waking up her mother when shouting out that there were, quote, beasts in the house. I mean, it affected her quite strongly emotionally. She remained in a state of shock for several days, but did quickly recover. At no time did she see any UFOs, but she does feel very strongly that the strange flashes of light she saw came directly from these strange entities that she was face to face with. What a strange case that is. And I have to wonder if somewhere on some UFO, the witness's ID card and used bus tickets are still up there. I don't know. They were never found. She had them before her encounter, but afterwards they were gone. Impossible to say, but certainly an interesting detail to this fascinating case. And now we have another case which is equally fascinating. I call this one a very close encounter. It occurred on November 1st, 1980 in Havsta, Sweden. It's a really compelling case because there are two witnesses who had a very close encounter with a UFO and humanoids, but there are also corroborating witnesses in the area who saw UFOs not only at that time, but around the same time as well. So this is probably what's happening in most of these cases, that there's UFO activity preceding and following an encounter. It's just that most people don't report it. So I'm glad the witnesses did report it in this case, and that this case was researched by investigators, because again, most aren't, most people don't report it, and the cases that we do see are clearly just the tip of the iceberg. This case was published in the April 1981 issue of the Swedish publication Svävaren, and it involves two witnesses who were sisters, Kristina Rydholm, age 30, and Nina Grunden, age 20. It began on a summer afternoon, actually in 1979, as Kristina, her husband, and 6-year-old daughter were taking a walk by Lake Langen when something weird happened. As Kristina says, "We heard a whistling sound, and all of us saw a strange grayish-blue oval object which hovered and vibrated in the air. A while later, this object disappeared towards Orebro. This is very close to where she saw it, and they didn't think too much about it, not until 1 year later when the UFO returned. On this occasion, it was 5:30 p.m. on November 1st, 1980, as Christina and again her younger sister Nina were driving along the road next to Lake Langen near the small town of Hovsta. This is where their family had a small summer cottage. And looking up, both sisters simultaneously noticed a bright object maneuvering in a strange, large, counterclockwise circular pattern. They could immediately tell that it was not a plane by its movement and appearance. In fact, Christina was a licensed pilot. The unusual nature of the object became even more obvious to both of them when it suddenly stopped, moved lower in the sky, and appeared to make this strange vibrating motion. So now had their full attention. The object then began to move again, making another wide circle about a half-mile wide. This time it began to move even closer to them, so close that Christina, who was driving, stopped the car, and both of them asked each other, "What are we seeing?" To their amazement, the object moved directly towards them, and by now it was at treetop level, and in moments it was less than 50 feet away. It was dark out at this time, so they couldn't really see the shape of the object clearly, also because there were two brilliant lights shining from the front of the object. But they could see a wide, curved window along one side, which seemed to indicate that the object was oval in shape. But more amazing was that they saw figures behind the window. As Christina says, inside we could see two gray-black creatures moving about, as if they were walking to and fro. Suddenly the two lights on the UFO went out, the object seemed to move away. The sisters began to switch seats so Nina could drive. Now the car was running the whole time, so they don't know if the object was making any noise. They couldn't hear any. But Nina pulled the car onto the road and started to drive off when suddenly the car engine mysteriously stopped, the headlights failed, and for the next 30 seconds the entire car began to shake and vibrate. At this point, neither of them were able to move. They felt as if they were, quote, locked up. And Christina said she had a weird, oppressive feeling in her head. And I'll just let her describe it. As she says, "It was like when you meet a large truck and the car gets blown by the wind. We sat there looking for the curious object, but there was nothing to be seen, neither on the sides nor in the front or back of the car. Maybe we thought it is immediately above our car. As the vibration stopped, we rediscovered the object through the front screen, and now we were able to drive off. We saw the object go back to its circular path and return towards the Kildsbergen Mountains. At the back of it were red and possibly yellow lights. It was strange, and we were terribly frightened. I was shocked and had an uneasy feeling. When I got home, I had many thoughts about the incident. I called the Täby airport, but they had closed for the day." Now, later researchers, after interviewing the sisters, learned that other people had seen the object. At the same time of this sighting, Kathy Wodell and her husband were only a few miles away in their home at nearby Rinkeby when they saw a red-yellow lighted object circling at treetop level. They watched it for several minutes as it moved off. Now, on November 3rd, just 2 days after this sighting, another witness, Gunnar Peterson, was in his home in the adjacent town of Orebro. It was about 10 p.m. when he saw a brilliant and strange light shining through his window. And again, I'll let Gunnar describe in his own words. As he says, "It was so strong that my attention was drawn from the TV. What I saw surprised me very much. At a distance of no more than 400 meters and at an altitude of about 100 meters, came upon a cigar-shaped object floating. It had a very strong greenish light. and yellow windows in a row. It moved slowly and no sound was heard. At the same time, my TV set went all black and stayed so until the cigar had disappeared out of sight. I have never seen anything like it before. What an unusual case that is, with a UFO coming so close and the car shaking as it did. Interestingly, that is a detail that does appear in a number of accounts. Not exactly sure what's going on there, but perhaps the UFO, the ETs, are doing that intentionally, or it's a byproduct of the magnetic fields that are surrounding the craft. Really hard to say for sure, I just don't know. But I can say that it has been reported before. And I also like that case because of the corroborating witnesses, including the gentleman whose TV malfunctioned when a UFO came real close to his house. So many interesting cases. And this next one is probably my favorite of this episode because it is quite unusual and does again have multiple witnesses and landing traces. I call this one Picnic with an Extraterrestrial. This occurred on April 26, 1984 in Italy, more specifically in Mount Sant'Antonio. This is a pretty rural area and a bunch of people were there. Unfortunately, only a few saw the humanoids and the UFO, but enough to provide multiple confirmation. And of course, landing traces were found as well. So it's a super fascinating case of a really unusual humanoid. This case, involving multiple witnesses and impressive landing traces, took place in a very rural area just west of Macomer, Italy, in Sardinia. This is a picnic and camping area known as Mount Sant'Antonio. A large group of about 300 people from the Sassari school had gathered there, including teachers, parents, and students. They had just arrived and were parking and bringing food in and starting to cook. This area does contain picnic tables, benches, campsites, fire pits, some fences, and of course the roadway and parking lot, but is otherwise untouched by civilization. One of the professors, Federico V., went walking into the woods surrounding the area to look for some firewood, and while doing so he heard a strange rustling noise and saw strange flashes of light. He also noticed that the tops of some of the bushes were swaying around, kind of like a helicopter was about to land, but of course there was no helicopter. So this was unusual, and he returned to the campsite where the janitor was beginning to set up the cooking, and he told him about it. But the janitor sort of dismissed it and said it was probably wild boars, which were known to frequent the area. So they started cooking and setting up when two other people, an adult by the name of Aldo C., and a 10-year-old student by the name of Pierre Luigi, they decided to check out the area around the campsite and by coincidence hiked out to where Federico had just been. They were going to admire the natural setting and take some photos. Reaching the area, they both heard a strange banging noise, kind of like an axe hitting a tree. And turning to look, they were amazed at what they saw. A very strange humanoid standing only about 25 feet away, with very short, 3 to 3.5 feet tall, robust, strongly built. It was only visible from the chest upwards, but they could see that it wore a light gray full-body jumpsuit and a gray helmet with these weird kind of golden spikes that seemed to shine with iridescence, all these different colors. The helmet did cover the entire head and had 2 small round holes where the eyes would be. Now Pierre, as he says, it was like a Roman helmet that covered the whole face. It looked like an overturned pot with nails stuck in and metal leaves around them. Now these spikes were about a few inches long, covered the entirety of the helmet, and again seemed to change color as the figure moved. Now, although his description is a little different, he said that the jumpsuit looked green and the helmet had what looked to him like a visor. But both also noticed apparently this craft sitting on the ground by a dense row of trees just a short distance away. Aldo, the adult, became upset and asked young Luigi if he also saw the humanoid. Luigi said yes and encouraged Mr. Aldo to remove the camera from his shoulder and take a photograph. Now, Aldo says he tried to do this, but found himself mysteriously unable to do so. He said the camera seemed to suddenly become impossibly heavy, to the point where it actually gave up on his efforts. The figure then held up one of its hands horizontally with the palm facing upwards, and moved the other on top of it, much in the manner Luigi says of writing on his palm. That's what it looked like to Luigi, and all the while was staring at the two astonished witnesses. Both Aldo and Luigi had the impression that the covering on the figure's hand was metallic. Aldo did say it looked almost like the being may have had some kind of tablet or something in its hand. At this point, Aldo made further efforts again to lift the camera, but still was unable to do it. All this time, an eerie silence enveloped the area. All the chirping of the birds and the rustling of the leaves disappeared completely. Everything was totally silent. And then something even more odd happened. As this figure continued to stare at them, both Aldo and Luigi felt a strange lightheadedness, almost as if they were being levitated up into the air. In fact, Aldo turned to Luigi and said, "Tell me if I am up in the air." Luigi looked and saw that Aldo was still on the ground, but Luigi says he also felt this strange levitating sensation and said it felt like he was also, quote, in the air. As Luigi says, "I looked at our feet, and our feet were on the ground, though I saw everything lower. I felt like I was taller." So Aldo made yet another effort to lift the camera, and after great effort, this time he was able to pull it off his shoulder. But as soon as he lifted it up to take a photo, the entity disappeared. It was just gone. The two witnesses at this point were quite unnerved, and they ran back in a panic to the cooking area, shouting out to the janitor, "A UFO! A UFO! We saw a UFO!" They estimate that this encounter lasted a full 10 minutes. Now another boy was standing near the cooking area, and he heard this loud hissing noise, and looking towards the source of the sound, saw a dome-shaped object with a flat bottom rise up about 15 feet from the ground, at which point it tilted, showing a red underside, and then darted off to the northeast, disappearing from sight in about 20 seconds. So Luigi was losing his mind at this point. He located his father and fearfully explained what happened. The head teacher said that the other boys were beginning to panic, and to control the situation, he told investigators they actually decided to accuse Luigi of making up the story and began to ridicule the teacher, who as a result would later refuse to speak to anybody about what happened. Needless to say, discussion about what happened continued, and finally the head teacher, Luigi's father, Luigi himself, and Federico returned to the area where they had seen all of this and found these weird circular landing traces, nearly circular, about 13 feet wide. It looked like the grass and vegetation had been crushed and yellowed or burned. There were also 2 parallel grooves, 6 feet long, a few inches wide, and 3 feet apart, depressed into the soil, less than 1 inch deep. Luigi noticed several strange footprints, a few where the entity had stood, and a few next to the burned section. So lunch was served at this point, but both Federico and Luigi were too shaken to eat, and instead they decided that they were going to go to the city of Macomber, just a few miles to the east, to make a report to the newspapers. Unfortunately, the office was closed, so they returned only to find that a young female student was now in tears. She had been heard screaming moments earlier, and returning to the camp, she said that she had seen this strange humanoid, apparently the same humanoid. She said it was standing by a rock and seeming to write on it with a pencil-like instrument. An undeniably amazing case with some really interesting details. I'm glad there were landing traces. I'm glad there were multiple witnesses because that provides an extra level of credibility to this account. I also found it fascinating that the witnesses described some really unusual effects, both feeling the sense of lightness or even levitation. Makes me wonder if there's something more going on there, extra levels of contact that they were not aware of. But it's also fascinating because people often ask, why doesn't someone take a picture? And here we have a witness trying so hard to take a picture, but could not do it. Just could not get to his camera, reporting this real sense of heaviness of the camera to the point where he could not get it off his shoulder, and finally broke free of whatever this was. And of course, that's when the ET had disappeared. It's a very interesting detail, but certainly does turn up in a number of cases. All right, moving along, and the next case I'd like to talk about I call Missing Time in Mirabel. This is another multiple witness case, August 2012 in Mirabel, Canada, and a really fascinating case because not only are there two witnesses, but they have some really interesting issues in terms of what they remember about this encounter. That alone is a very important detail that I think speaks volumes about what actually happened here. It was early August 2012 as an anonymous man and his girlfriend, soon to be his wife, were going for a ride on his motorcycle to enjoy the warm weather in this area of Mirabel, Canada. So after a day of this, it was around 4 a.m. and they were driving the back roads. They had just passed the Autodrome at St. Eustache, as you can see here, and they were moving at about 40 miles per hour when he noticed a light on the horizon. And he first wondered if it might be a bright star or perhaps a plane. But it was unusual, so he pointed it out to his girlfriend and asked, "Is that a star?" She replied that she had no idea, but together they kept an eye on it, watching as it moved towards them, becoming increasingly bright. And they were both puzzled, because it seemed to be moving far too slow to be a plane. It was also at a very low altitude, right over Route 148, directly ahead of them. So he sped up to intercept it, realized that he had miscalculated its speed. It was going slower than he thought. So he backtracked a short distance so he could continue to watch this thing more closely. He parked the bike. They both got off to better observe this object. There was no other traffic on the road at this time. And the next thing they knew, this object was directly overhead, and the witness says he was struck with a beam of light. As he says in his own words, "Heat pierced my body. I was alone in the world as I tried to accept what we saw. My girlfriend, who was a few yards to my left, no longer existed for me. I was so entrenched in my bubble, I lost all my bearings. Transfixed by the lights on the object, I could not under any circumstances stop staring." Now he said that this object was now extremely close. He felt like it was just feet away from him. It was circular. It had a row of what looked like rectangular windows around the edge, kind of reminding him of store windows. He said a rectangular box stuck out from the bottom of this object, and it was surrounded by powerful and very pure-looking white lights. He said the object was causing a gentle wind to blow down on them, but most amazing was that there was the silhouette of a humanoid looking down at him from one of the windows. They both watched as this object moved slowly overhead, over the field behind them, and then suddenly something very strange happened. As the witness says, curiously, we were promptly seated on the bike, well before the disappearance of the object on the horizon. Now the witness does not understand this, why they didn't stay off the bike to watch this object until it moved off, but now all they could see was a small red light moving away. Another weird thing is that they did not discuss this sighting afterwards, another detail he couldn't understand. They just drove off as if nothing happened and didn't think about it again. In fact, he pretty much forgot about it. It wasn't until a few months later when a friend of his, Jan Vadnais, who happens to be a prominent Canadian UFO researcher, called the witness to talk about some of the recent sightings he had investigated. And this is when the witness immediately and spontaneously recalled his own encounter, which shocked him so bad he said it was like, quote, a punch in the face. He turned to his wife and told her about the sighting. To his shock, while she remembered the sighting, she had no recollection whatsoever of seeing a humanoid in the window. So he's now pretty certain there was some kind of missing time. He's considering hypnosis. I don't know if this was ever done, and that is now where this case stands. Just judging from the witness's description of what happened to them and the fact that the wife has no memory of seeing the humanoid, he found himself suddenly back on his motorcycle. The feeling that he had of being utterly alone in the world and this pervasive silence, all of these details point towards a possible much closer encounter. I think the missing time really is a dead giveaway. He has not undergone hypnosis as far as I know, but certainly a really fascinating case of a very close-up encounter with a humanoid. And now we move to the last case of this episode, which is quite unique, and I call this one the alien in the rectangle. It occurred on September 8, 2012 in a city in Russia called Penza Ternovka. And I like this case because there does appear to be some interaction between the witness and this UFO and humanoid. It's quite an unusual description. And I also like it because it is a multiple witness case with another witness seeing apparently the same object from a different perspective. So that makes it an important case. We also don't hear a whole lot about cases from Russia, so that also I think makes it important. And it points to what we already know, that these cases are going on all over this planet. This last and final case was investigated and illustrated by Russian researcher Vladimir Kukonikov of the Penza Kosmopolsk group, which is dedicated to studying UFOs. It was about 8:30 p.m. September 8, 2012, as a woman by the name of Kononova Irina Dmitrievna noticed a dark red rectangular object floating in the western sky. She said she could see it easily because it contrasted sharply against the darkness, and it was about, she estimates, maybe 300 to 350 feet away. She estimates it was about 5 feet long and maybe 2.5 feet wide. Now when she first noticed it, it appeared to be still in the sky, but very quickly it began to move and descend towards her, at the same time seeming to change in shape to a trapezoid. And it continued to move towards her until it approached to a distance of about 150 feet, very close. And this is when she noticed something amazing. In the center of this object was a dark, almost black figure with its legs together and its arms extended from its side. She says it kind of reminded her of those little glowing figures you see at stoplights, crosswalks. Now, other than this being less than 3 feet tall, it did have normal human proportions. Again, seemed to be floating in the center of the object. This object itself, which had been a solid red, now seemed to be overlapped with a series of crisscrossing grid lines, forming a series of diamond-shaped patterns no more than 5 inches wide, she estimates. Now, Kononova found herself becoming weirdly elated at the sight of this object. And in fact, she had the feeling that the occupant of this object had noticed that she was observing it and had come closer specifically to allow her a closer view. She thought this particularly because it was facing her directly. Once it reached its closest point, it retreated. It moved to the north and then disappeared from view behind a neighbor's house, and it was gone. Now, interestingly, just over 1 month later, on October 18, again 2012, about 3 miles from Kononova's sighting, there was another incident. The witness is Eleonora Pavlovna Sorokina, and she was in her home in nearby Michurinsky when she looked out her window and saw an almost identically described object, this glowing, vertical, red, almost rectangular object. She said it did have a rounded top. There was this light coming from the top, which sort of gave it this rounded appearance. But she said that this object was very close to the same size and width that the other witness described, Kananova. Now, she was able to get an accurate estimate of its size because it was hovering very close to this nearby cell tower, only about 900 feet away. And there was, again, this brilliant red light shining from the top. This object was moving towards her when suddenly it appeared to split into two, both of which moved off pretty quickly into a cloud. Now, there's a weird synchronicity because it was that same evening that Eleonora was watching TV and Konanova's sighting was being aired on the television. So Eleonora was struck by how identical the appearance was of the object she saw. So she concluded pretty quickly that she had seen the same object. There you go, 10 cases reaching all the way back to the 1900s up to 2012. All different types of humanoids coming from all over the world. Really close-up interactions with humanoids. It's so clear to me by this point that we are not alone, and I understand that there are skeptics out there, and I understand that people have different ideas about who these guys are and where they come from, which is fine, and that's why I present these cases in a factual basis, just giving you the facts as we know them, and letting you guys decide for yourselves what's going on here. So, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I really want to thank you for watching. Again, it's because of you I do these episodes, so I truly appreciate all the support you give and the wonderful comments and input on each episode and each case. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep searching for the truth because it's out there. Keep asking those hard questions because it's up to us to find the truth. Our governments are not going to give it to us. And most of all, keep having fun. That's why we're here. What would life be if we weren't having fun? So I'll see y'all next time. Have a good week. Bye.